Introducing health and wellness advocate, veteran international real estate investment expert, author and speaker, Adiel Gorel.
Health tips, fitness tips, nutrition and well-being, world-class experts, all right here on my podcast, The Adiel Gorel Show. You talked about salivary test strips, and if anybody that is listening and watching this, anybody is going to want to be really good about nitric oxide. So can you explain about the salivary test strips and how and when to use them?
Yeah, Adiel, that was when we first developed we productized some of my discoveries. So unfortunately, people don't want to change their diet. They don't want to change their lifestyle. People want a magic pill. That doesn't exist. It hasn't existed and it never will exist. So what we did is we basically provided product technology that could restore nitric oxide production. So when we did this over 10 years ago, through a number of focus groups and market research, nobody knows what nitric oxide is today. 10 years ago, it was even worse. So what we found was that people go, well, how do I know if I need nitric oxide? And the challenge was there's not a blood test. Your doctor can't tell you that you can't pull blood and say, oh, your nitric oxide levels are this, like they can for vitamin D or cholesterol or triglycerides and things like that. So I had to develop a test for this. And so understanding how the body recycles, regenerates nitrite and nitrate, we developed a salivary test strip. And it's very useful. But I tell people it's a good tool to have in your toolbox, but it shouldn't be the only tool you're using. Because and the beauty of it is it's a point of care solution that you can apply some saliva to the end of this test strip, and within a matter of seconds, you'll see a color change, or we hope you see color change. But if it turns bright pink, then there's a pretty good chance your body gets sufficient nitric oxide. If it doesn't turn pink, then that tells us that your body is nitrogen deficient. Now, what it doesn't tell us is why. Is it because you have endothelial dysfunction? Is it because you're using a mouthwash daily? Is it because you're using antacids? Or is it because you're just not eating enough green leafy vegetables to allow these nutrients to recycle and generate nitric oxide? So there's really no such thing as a false negative. There are false positives. So for example, if you've got an active oral infection, or you've got gingivitis, periodontal disease, where you've got an active inflammation in the mouth, then that test strip will turn bright pink, but it's indicative of the local inflammation in the mouth and not systemic. So, we see all the time where people show up, they have high blood pressure, they have erectile dysfunction, they have kidney dysfunction or renal insufficiency, but yet they turn the test strip bright pink. And then I ask them, do you have any oral issues or dental infections? And they go, oh yeah, I've got a really bad toothache or root canal, and so that explains it. So then when you go and get all the dental issues remediated, then it's really a true indicator of systemic health at that point.
Okay, so L-arginine is the go-to thought when people think about nitric oxide, but I believe the arginine pathway deteriorates with age and also has some other limitations. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, it's a very good point. So right after the Nobel Prize was awarded in the late 90s, the market was saturated with nitric oxide products. And basically they contain, many, many milligrams, thousands of milligrams of L-arginine. As a biochemist, this never made sense to me because we know how much arginine is needed to bind to the enzyme to make nitric oxide. So there's never a deficiency of L-arginine. And so taking more, it never made sense to me that why you would give more, because even in the sickest of patients, they have about 20 to 40 times more arginine than what's needed to bind the enzyme and to make nitric oxide. Giving arginine to a patient that's nitric oxide deficient is like putting gas in a car with a blown up engine. These people aren't out of fuel, they're not out of L-arginine. They've lost the ability to convert it into nitric oxide. So that's number one. And so L-arginine products don't work in patients that are nitric oxide deficient. because as you mentioned, the older you get, the less nitric oxide you make from L-arginine. And so what we have to do is we have to focus on the engine, the enzyme. That's what we do. We fix that so your body's able to better convert arginine to nitric oxide. Now the problem is that you can actually do more harm than good, because if you take a lot of L-arginine, you actually increase the expression of an enzyme called arginase that diverts the arginine away from nitric oxide and toward ornithine and urea production. So you can actually do more harm than good. And then there are a number of clinical trials that have demonstrated this in patients. The patients who have just had a heart attack were given high-dose arginine, and they actually killed more people in the arginine group than the placebo. Same thing happens in people with peripheral arterial disease. You give them arginine, they get worse. So you have to understand the enzymology and the biochemistry of this reaction in order for it to make sense. And arginine products have never made sense to me.
That is absolutely fascinating, and I believe useful, because so many products are out there using L-arginine. Now, we talked about veggies, green leafy, beets. What about fruits?
Fruits, they're really not a significant source of nitrate and nitrite. They provide a lot of important antioxidants that help. So it's a system, right? So you've got, everything to me in biochemistry is about counting electrons. And so to make nitrite from nitrate, you need a 2-electron reduction. To make nitric oxide, this is a 1-electron reduction. So you've got to have an electron donor. And that's where these antioxidants that you get from not just green leafy vegetables, but from fruits that are high in antioxidants, they provide kind of the catalytic machinery and the electrons to allow the nitric oxide to be produced.
Okay, thank you. One of the things you just mentioned, and you mentioned it, a couple of times, is we, meaning probably your research team, have. So is there, I know that everybody wants to have a magic pill, and you said there isn't any, but still, when you say we have, what is there that you guys have found or created or are working on that could boost nitric oxide?
Well, I'm not going to get into product names because I do have a conflict of interest in these. I have over 24 issued U.S. and international patents. I have a number of both in the nutrition and dietary supplement field, as well as drugs and phase 3 clinical trials. So my objective is to not promote and push products. My objective is to provide education and awareness so that consumers can then make informed decisions. And so I'll tell you kind of broadly that I developed a nitric oxide lozenge. So again, this is very tricky because how do you generate nitric oxide and recapitulate NO production of a gas that's gone in less than a second? So I developed a lozenge, and so the design is that you create this matrix where you've got these actives that are physically separated by this matrix. And then when you put the lozenge in your mouth, it slowly begins to dissolve. So this matrix falls apart, the actives come together, and you generate nitric oxide gas. So that product's been on the market for 10 years in the nutrition and dietary supplement space. We make beet powders that's used by several hundred professional and NCAA collegiate teams, the Olympic athletes. So what I tell people is look for 4 things on products. Look for patents. My products are patented. That tells the consumer that this is a unique and innovative product. I mean, that's the definition of a patent. You've done something that no one else has been able to do and no one can do because you own the patents to it. Number 2, look for published clinical trials. If a product works, if your product makes nitric oxide, it will have clinical benefits. And so you should be able to demonstrate this in randomized placebo-controlled clinical trials. We have probably a dozen published clinical trials on my product technology. And then number 3 is the inventor. If you search the internet, you will find my products. We have a very broad presence there. But look and just do a Medline or PubMed search, and if there's a product out there, try to find the inventor or the formulator and see if they've published anything in the nitric oxide field. So you've got a lot of these products that so-called have talking heads, and I do a literature search and they've never published a single paper in the nitric oxide field. It's humorous. Big pharma has been unable to develop safe and effective nitric oxide drugs. So some person off the street who has no experience in biochemistry and never published in the nitric oxide space suddenly can make a nitric oxide product. It's
okay. I realize very fully that you're careful. We are here to get the wisdom and the experience for our life. It's wonderful, but I can't help it. I'm interested, very interested. I want to make myself better. How do I, or somebody else who is viewing, get an access to you? Is there, I know you don't want to say a name of a product because you have a, but I still would like to bridge that gap, because even selfishly, and for all our viewers, I want us to be able to get that lozenge, get the specific beet powder. I know there are a million beet powders out there. How can we bridge the gap, and can you please guide us? I'm asking, so it's me, it's not you, it's me. Yeah.
Well, I think, again, if you do a PubMed search, so if you just go to PubMed, which is P-U-B-D.
I'm sorry, the sound, P-U?
P-U-B, pub, like publication, med, M-E-D, P-U-B-M-E-D, it's PubMed. And there's a search bar up there, and if you just put nitric oxide, S Bryan, you will find our published clinical trials on that particular product. And in those published clinical trials, it'll tell you which product that is. So I think that keeps it clean, because this is in the public domain. It's published literature. I'm an author on some of these papers, and some of them I'm not an author because of the conflict of interest issue. But I think if you search hard enough, you're going to find products, and look for products with patents. If it's got a patent on there, and you can Google my name and look at my patents, and then cross-reference my patents with the ones that are on that product, and that's the easiest way.
That's fair. That's very fair. One question about the lozenge, assuming that I found it. It seems as though the ideal, based on what I hear so far, would be that the lozenge is in your mouth pretty much all the time, because you want to, or is that not the case? I mean, if you use it 30 minutes a day versus all day long, because the half-life is short.
Well, that's a very good point. So what we do is we've made a very deliberate dissolution rate. So we know how much nitric oxide a normal, healthy person makes over 24 hours. And my philosophy is you never give the body something that it's not used to seeing. So when we develop this lozenge, we deliberately generate a certain amount of nitric oxide over a certain period of time. So that lozenge will take about anywhere from 6 to 8 minutes to completely dissolve. And in that 6 to 8 minutes, it's generating nitric oxide gas. And so we do it in the mouth because, if you're taking proton pump inhibitors, we bypass all that. So you get the same effect every single person, whether you're using a mouthwash, whether you're using antacids, anything. So we control that nitric oxide release. But because of this enterosalivary circuit, whereby the nitrate and nitrite are constantly recycled, for the next several hours, every time you swallow your saliva, you're getting a burst of nitric oxide in the stomach.
There you go.
It's a very deliberate time release. And so if you use this one lozenge twice a day, it provides you 24-hour coverage.
That was great, extremely useful, really. So now I'm going in another, direction. You talk about chewing well. I mean, I know I'm guilty of chewing not well. We had somebody on the show, he talked about mindfulness, and he said, take at least one meal a day where you don't read the newspaper or the news while you eat. I'm a big offender here. I eat fast and aggressively. I think some male friends of mine are the same. You talk about chewing well.
So, it's known for a number of years that the longer the time that you chew and masticate your food, the better. So it's not just, crunching it up into smaller pieces, but it's also allowing for a longer residence time in the mouth to give the bacteria to activate and utilize these nitrogen sources, primarily in the form of nitrate, to more efficiently reduce it to nitrite. So that every time you swallow your saliva, then you're getting a boost of nitric oxide in the lumen of the stomach. So I think again, it's common sense. Eat your vegetables, eat slowly, and don't spit, right? Because when you spit, you basically eliminate the benefits of that.
But you know, I have to say, many of my male friends, and that includes me too, are sinning here in the sense that eating fast and, you know, aggressively. And so that's a lot. And, you know, everyone talks about it. The monks, the mindfulness people talk about chewing well. And by the way, this is a good segue into a beautiful thing that you mentioned in your latest book about the common, you know, elements between nitric oxide and what we call qi or qi. You know, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so qi goes back to this concept thousands and thousands of years in traditional Chinese medicine. It's what animates the human. And so this has kind of been this nebulous concept in Chinese medicine where, you know, people try to quantify qi or identify qi, but really qi is, nitric oxide is the qi that's been described in traditional medicine for thousands of years. So people that have a disruption in this are more susceptible to disease. And when you restore qi, then you improve circulation, blood flow, and you can basically animate the organism and the organs and overcome a lot of that. And even in acupuncture, you know, we've done studies in showing that certain techniques in acupuncture and traditional medicines, we published on this, I think, in 2009, can be explained through a nitric oxide related phenomenon.
So that is fascinating, because if we look at acupuncture and we talk about qi being nitric oxide, let's say for just a second, we assume that when you release some of those meridians, some of those pathways, you may just be letting the gas flow freely in the system. It's fascinating. And
that's right.
In your book, there is a fascinating table that you made. Nitric oxide and qi, the way qi has been described, and all the nitric oxide thing that we see, and it's really quite striking. I think it's a great way of looking at it. One other question. We talked about breathing a lot here on this show, and clearly we should breathe through our nose. It's been shown when we breathe through the nose, we create nitric oxide in the lining of, the cavity. Humming has been shown to generate up to 15 times as much nitric oxide. So can you talk a little bit about your perspective of breathing through the nose and humming vis-a-vis nitric oxide?
Yeah, so the highest concentration of the enzyme nitric oxide synthase is thought to reside in the sinuses and the nasal airway passages. And so again, those cells, when activated through these mechanoreceptors, through deep breathing, turn that enzyme on. So the challenge has been, it's just like an endothelial dysfunction. If you have the enzyme that is dysfunctional in the endothelial cells of the blood vessels, then that enzyme is also dysfunctional in the epithelial airway cells. So you can try these deep breathing exercises, but if you have endothelial dysfunction and that enzyme is uncoupled, you're not going to get any nitric oxide produced by humming or deep breathing. So what you have to do is take a step back, employ the strategies that we talk about to restore endothelial function and recoupling of that enzyme, and then you can get the nitric oxide benefits of nasal breathing, breathing through your nose, humming. And we've actually quantified this. We have a nitric oxide analyzer. We can do these deep breathing exercises and detect the increase in nitric oxide production, as well as humming. So it's very verifiable, and we can determine this, really the degree of dysfunction you have from, say, a 50 or 60-year-old person to a 20 or 30-year-old person. The amount of nitric oxide they produce from humming or nasal breathing is vastly different.
That is a very, very illuminating way of looking at it, because it seemed so promising. Breathe through your nose, hum, it's going to be good for you. But you're saying, yes, if this works. If it doesn't, it's not going to be as good for you. But you can still make it work, assuming you didn't pass the threshold. Now, one of the things, there is a lot of talk recently that I've been looking into about bitters and how the bitter taste is lacking in Western society, but it's very plentiful in the Eastern diet. And in your book, something that struck me, you talk about the back of the tongue. And the back of the tongue happens to also be where a lot of receptors for the bitter taste reside. And I may even have an interview right on this show about the benefits of bitters. So is there any link that jumps at you when I say it or not?
Well, not as it relates to bitters, but in terms of the dorsal part of the tongue, you know, we're interested in the microbiome. You know, there have been a lot of studies in the microbiome. We focus primarily in the oral cavity because that's where digestion begins. It's usually our first access to the outside world. And so there's many, many bacteria, communities of bacteria that live in the mouth. And so it's a competition for limited resources. So the bacteria that we're interested in on the dorsal part of the tongue that live deep in the crypts of the tongue, and they're referred to as facultative anaerobes, meaning that they can respire with oxygen or without oxygen. But they're the ones that are reducing nitrate to nitrite and to nitric oxide. So I don't know what association, if any, bitters or bitter tasting compounds have on those nitrate reducing bacteria, but there are a number of things that we do know. We know that eating more green leafy vegetables provides more substrate for these bacteria, so you're basically giving them a competitive advantage in this very competitive environment. Number two, tongue scraping. You know, we've shown that that completely changes the oral microbiome, and that's an old ancient technique that most people aren't familiar with anymore, but people who do tongue scraping once or twice a day, in a paper we published several years ago, tended to have lower blood pressure. And we could correlate that with the changes in specific nitrate-reducing bacteria.
So wait, just to clarify and be 100% clear, tongue scraping is a useful thing to do.
Well, there's two parts to that story in the paper we published. So tongue scraping alone is good, but if you're doing tongue scraping and using antiseptic mouthwash, then that's a very bad thing. We see the highest increase in blood pressure from people who do tongue scraping and use mouthwash. So tongue scraping alone is good, but antiseptic mouthwash, even without tongue scraping, appears to be very bad.
But for the person who does not use, the mouthwash at all, and is just, interested in benefits of what they can do, is it better to tongue scrape or not to tongue scrape?
Now, the data that we published several years ago indicates or suggests that tongue scraping is beneficial. It changes the entire oral microbiome and tends to have, people that scrape their tongue tend to have lower blood pressure.
Okay, of course I understand why if you tongue scrape and use the mouthwash, clearly it's gonna cause harm. But if you don't, then it's a beneficial thing. I have to ask you, you said you're a scientist, you have your research, the patents, incredibly, really quite important stuff. A person has an urge to reach out to you. And you said you are, approached by people with certain illnesses. And how can a person get in touch with you or maybe consult with you? Is there a pathway for that?
Yeah, sure. Look, I try to be as accessible as I can. I still travel hundreds of thousands, over 100,000 miles a year, giving lectures all over the world. And, we've got a lot of projects going on with drug development and other projects. But I tell people, go to my website. It's an educational website, drnathansbryan.com, and they can reach me through an email through that site.
Dr. Bryan, I have to say this may have been the most important interview that we have had. This is so, elemental to life, health, even our vital force. This is crazy important. And I feel very, I feel a lot of gratitude that you took the time to share this with us. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Adiel. I never turn down an opportunity to educate and inform, because this truly is a condition to where what you don't know can kill you. Because if people understand and appreciate how important this is, And to really do these very simple techniques to restore nitric oxide production, it truly is life-changing. So thank you for the opportunity to inform and educate your viewers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Bryan, for being on our show.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining me today for the second part of our amazing interview. If you didn't catch part 1, don't miss out. The link is in the description below for you. And be sure to click the subscribe button for more videos.